Welcome to Protect, Suicide Prevention Training Podcast for Healthcare Professionals. I'm Manan, consultant psychiatrist, founder, and head of faculty at Progress Guide. Good day, listeners. I'm back again with Tracey Chitty. We are on the other side of the World Suicide Prevention Day, and I'm hoping that you have had a chance to listen to our feature film length podcast. It's available on YouTube as well, with Mallory Dissell and Lord McCammon. Well, the goal was to have a few laughs and in the process make a complete and utter fool of myself. Hopefully you all managed to get a few laughs out of it as well. We were working on how you discover your own funny. So things that you can have a laugh about, your team can have a laugh about. And that is incredibly important as healthcare workers, a way that in which you can fill up your own cup again, because we are giving all the time. And there has to be a way in which you manage to find your own funny within your team, find certain things to laugh about. Hopefully today we will be able to go through a few more of the topics that we covered with Tracey Chitty with the English Schools Foundation. So carrying on with the recap that we did in the last podcast, we talked about the core module. We covered the 4 chapters in the core module. Tracey, do you remember any of the stuff that we talked about, or you've had too many sleeps in between now and then?
I remember us talking about the care compass.
Mm-hmm.
How we can use that to facilitate conversations. And yes, I would have to rethink about our conversation now.
Yeah. So that's one of the crucial things, risk versus recovery, how you use the care compass to facilitate those conversations. I'm at the verge of, actually, I've begun something quite exciting. We are working on a series of 16 different masterclasses where we are taking a specific problem. It's a sequence called STOP, solutions to our problems. I love acronyms. So S for solutions, T for two, and O for hour, and P for problems. And I was chatting with Annie and Gemma this week, and we're saying, hey, I've started this thing. And the first masterclass is based on the care compass. And the problem that we talk about is there are never enough beds, or the caseloads are just kind of blowing out, or wait times in ED are very long, or lengths of stay on the wards are very long. So this is a very common problem that we have in healthcare. Anyone who is in a leadership position on a day-to-day basis is dealing with this. And we have been designing a masterclass based on that, on the care compass, around how you can take positive risks. How do you strike a balance between risk and recovery? Because without risk, there is no recovery. With the right care, the person has more control, and we use the broken record technique to go on and on about it. So simultaneously working on 16 different masterclasses with problems that keep coming up over and over again. Documentation was poor again. Psychological autopsy study after study comes up. Family was not consulted again. These things keep coming up. And how do you actually overcome them? So that care compass is a very crucial chapter in the Protect module. We also had the whole thing around life versus death, and how you have conversations around digging deep and getting to the bottom of someone's pain. Their need to be pain-free and our need to help them be pain-free, which was chapter 2, and then the chapter 3 was around the continuum of risk. Right? We talked about high, medium, low. How do we get to that continuum? And chapter 4 was all about empathy in action. Like the STOP series in that chapter 4 will form the basis of a masterclass called Tick and Flick. So how do you get past the culture of tick and flick? And a lot of us working in who have leadership roles really struggle with changing that culture. So we're designing a masterclass around that. And then we ended, sorry, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say, all those school counsellors work at a different level. Mm-hmm. All those things you've named still resonate for school counsellors.
Yeah.
In terms of numbers and counsellors available, but the number of students turning up at the door, presenting in certain ways, resources, how to really connect and change a conversation around what matters to you.
Yeah.
They still resonate at a different level, though. So I'm excited to hear about this masterclass.
Yeah. And I think it would be a great, so a lot of people do the protect training. They go away, they use some of the skills. It's a great way to revamp those skills as well again. And some of the school counselors have taken me up on the offer of what I had said, get in touch with me on WhatsApp. And actually, you all are dealing with some really complex, young people with lots of complex problems and complex issues. So I've had a few discussions. And yeah, I'm happy to kind of provide them that support on WhatsApp. They have got in touch with me. And so a lot of those concepts which apply to health also apply in the educational setting.
We're talking about people and psychological pain. Doesn't really matter which sector it is.
Exactly. So I think we finished the last podcast when we were doing the recap on that critical concept of rational versus rationalizing. So in a rational world, we look at all the facts and then we come to our conclusion or decision. In a rationalizing world, we have made our decision very early in the process, and then the way in which we elicit the information, that completely skews the information we elicit, the way we process the information, we minimize certain things, we maximize other things in keeping with the decision we have made. So it skews the process. And whether that be in a health context or in an educational context, like in an educational context, if you are really worried about someone's risk and you do not want a child to return back to school and you've already made that decision, then you might just fixate on all the things that can potentially go wrong, right? And not actually look at the progress that the child has made or the protective factors or the treatment they're having or the response to the treatment. You might just completely minimize that and you can maximize all that's gone wrong. Similarly, the reverse can happen as well, that you want the child to come back to school and you just focus then on all the things that have gone well and not take in the things that haven't gone so well. So it can work both ways. So the goal is not so much that your decision changes. You might arrive at the same decision, but let's do it in a rational way. Let's look at the facts, consider all the facts, give equal weighting to all the facts, and not just weighting to the facts that are in keeping with your decision. And that was a crucial part of the AWARE framework. And I think that's where the rational versus rationalizing is based on the AWARE study. And there were 5 themes. The first was around anxiety. An assessment has 2 parts. One that we all know, the word assessment, what it says on the tin. And the other is actually to contain the crisis, because through the process of assessment, you're containing the crisis. And these 2 purposes of an assessment could be at cross purposes, because one increases anxiety. The more you dig, the more you find, the more anxious everyone feels. Whereas the other, which kind of involves capturing hope, crisis resolution, is supposed to bring everyone's anxiety down. So the same action increases anxiety and decreases anxiety. And you could get into a place, what Sean Shea, the suicidologist, calls premature crisis resolution. So before you have done the entire exploration of how much risk there is, you begin containing the risk, right? And that can happen that you haven't done a thorough enough assessment and you have moved into crisis resolution. And it feels good because you are decreasing your own anxieties, you're decreasing the person's anxiety, you're decreasing the family's anxiety. But anxiety is a critical factor. It influences the way in which we engage a person in that assessment process. Any reflections on that as to school counselors and particularly the life guide teaching that we did when we were talking about suicidal distress? You could just see even through Zoom, I could sense people's anxiety when we were talking about working with children who were in suicidal distress.
As I said previously, I think it's a huge factor in schools. It's very, very hard to have a student come and say they're in suicidal distress and not all of a sudden want to actually just move them on because it makes us feel better, the counsellor, but also the school feel better. Whereas what you're talking about is a dual process going on. Yeah. And through the assessment, you're also capturing hope and there's some prevention happening right at the same time. But, as I was reflecting on this previously, I actually drew a scale and it's not necessarily one over the other, but you need to be able to manage and hold both to be able to go into the exploring and understanding much more about the psychological distress and the suicide ideation, to be able to manage that ourselves while also holding hope and the client on the other hand. It's I think it's a challenge, but it's hard to capture. Actually, it's quite a spectacular kind of balance.
It is. And I guess mental health professionals do it every day, but how fair is it to expect those who are working in schools to also do that, given all the other responsibilities they have got? But assessment is the first treatment session as well, right? So, because as you said, you're capturing hope. Hope is the antidote to suicidal distress. So if you're capturing hope, that's part of the treatment process. Yes.
One of the things that I think school counsellors certainly have an advantage on, so of course, sometimes we'll have students who just turn up right there and then, who are showing suicidal ideation, but they also might be clients that you've been working with for a long time. And so we also have a lot of knowledge around strengths and connections and interests to draw on that we can draw on immediately, which perhaps in a hospital setting, you don't have that ready access information.
Yeah, and that's one of the big problems in hospital settings. And a lot of our patients say this in their feedback, that the moment they have walked through the hospital gates, they have become a patient. Their identity as a father, mother, son, daughter, software programmer, or the different roles they play in the community. They may be a soccer coach. All of that gets stripped away from them and they become a patient. Hospitals have traditionally worked on a deficits-based model where you diagnose, you look for the symptoms and signs of particular conditions which you are then treating. So it is incredibly challenging to step out of that deficits mindset and to step into an assets-focused way where you are connecting the person with their strengths, with their natural circle of support. And yes, in schools, you all have that challenge. You all have that challenge, but you all have that knowledge that goes with it as well, because you all have seen the child kind of grow and blossom up to the point where they've run into mental health challenges, right? So you have all that knowledge to draw on as well.
100%. Even if the student isn't known to the counsellor, there are plenty of adults and people in the school, friends, who can see their strengths and their skills. In schools, I often talk about strengths-based, skills-focused. That's how we work alongside individuals. So yes, even though a counsellor doesn't know that student, there's plenty of people who do.
Yeah. So anxiety is the first factor in AWARE, and then we had weighting. Certain diagnoses just tend to be weighted more than others. For example, people with borderline personality disorder or substance misuse, their suicidality counts for less. If suicidality originates from social factors, that seems to count for less. Not that their suicidal distress is any less. And this is important because a lot of people with borderline personality disorder often have a range of social factors that have fallen apart in their life, and you begin to see that in the high secondary schools where 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and you see a fair bit of that self-harming, which is almost like a pandemic in our schools at the moment. There's this peer pressure to cut and self-harm. And also the other thing is that chronic presentations often do not tend to draw the same attention as acute presentations. But you also get that acute on chronic presentation where there has been an sudden escalation in their risk. They have gone from self-harming once a week to self-harming every day, or self-harming in the concealed parts of their body to self-harming on their neck and face, or their cuts have become deeper. And people do not pick up because it's very difficult to differentiate someone who has chronic suicidality and a self-harming from an acute on chronic presentation. So there's the weighting on what we put on the person's symptoms. Just conventionally, we tend to take people who have an acute episode much more seriously than those who are presenting with chronic suicidality. The reality is that people with chronic suicidality may have become, they might have lost touch with hope. So that's a real problem, and that needs to be taken seriously.
I like I just want to pick up on the point around the self-harming and suicide, because often we can hear that, well, I've heard come from teachers and from parents around self-harming as a way to relieve pain. Therefore, we are concerned, we're absolutely concerned because they're in pain, that suicide is wanting to end it all. And it's almost because of the language, because they haven't dug down deep, that they're treated as two separate issues, rather than actually this child, the student, client is in psychological distress, and it's a continuum of measures which they're taking. And so digging down deep and identifying psychological pain and how they're going to express that or what they're thinking about that, I think that's very, very helpful through this training.
Absolutely. And, as you said, it's a continuum. It's a continuum because you are developing, every time you self-harm, you're developing what we call acquired capability. So you see that in soldiers, doctors, dentists, vets. There are certain groups of people who are desensitized to the idea of death and pain. And every time someone self-harms, they are getting desensitized to this idea of pain. And there's a fair bit of research on acquired capability, which shows that people who have, for example, attempted suicide 3 to 5 times are qualitatively different from those who have attempted suicide once, who are qualitatively different from those who have never attempted suicide. So within each of us, there is a very strong life force to avoid pain and death. And it takes, when someone has crossed that bridge between life and death and has chosen death over life, that is quite an important choice that one has made. And suicide as pain relief, once you have acted on it, has truly entered their lexicon. So it's very different in terms of qualitative, and self-harm is that precursor where you're developing that acquired capability. So absolutely, it needs to be taken seriously. And you're right. We need to kind of, yes, they might have self-harm to feel something. They might have self-harm to have a release. But at the heart of it, there is some deep-seated psychological pain that the self-harm is addressing. And that needs to be explored and understood in a supportive way, not in a judgmental, pejorative way, but and there's a lot of stigma attached to self-harm as well. Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's on that continuum, needs to be taken as seriously.
So I think when we're talking about the weighting and chronic versus acute, I think it can easily happen that yes, they self-harm, and yes, we've got the supports, and so therefore that intentional asking around suicide can be overlooked. So I thank you for expanding on that.
Yeah, and that's what I mean, that you get desensitized as a school counselor. You can get desensitized to someone's suicidality. But if it's gradually creeping up, as they say, you can have you can literally boil a frog alive if you turn the Bunsen burner slowly up. But you drop a frog into a hot water, kind of boiling hot water, they will jump straight out. So from someone looking on from the outside who's seeing this young person for the first time with their self-harming having escalated to that extent, they might go, oh my God, why isn't someone doing something? But the school counselor might have been exposed to this for the last 6 months in sessions, and you have just become desensitized to the self-harming, and it's gradually increasing. So that's a really good point. Chronic suicidality, it's very easy to miss in terms of how, of course, we're not saying that everyone, anytime someone self-harms, they should end up in a psychiatric hospital. Absolutely not. And we talk about it later within the STEPS model, where we kind of say acute suicidality, respond to it as if you're responding to someone having a heart attack, right? You go in, you take control. Chronic suicidality, you respond to it as if someone has got diabetes. You engage in a lot of education. If you have a large slice of cake, this is the amount of insulin you need to take. So you're building those resources. So in a similar way, you help the person understand suicidal urges can be mastered. This is what you need to do to master those suicidal urges. It is equally important work. It's different kind of work, but it's equally important. And that focus needs to be kept on that self-harming as it's carrying on. Then you have those acute and chronic presentations where it is like someone with diabetes is having a heart attack. They are at very high risk. It's just like chronic suicidality. Their risk is elevated, and then you have that acute on chronic presentation. So that was waiting. Then we looked at agenda, which is, we've seen with health professionals that if you detect an agenda in a particular patient, you just end up developing antibodies to it, particularly if the agenda is to get into hospital or get something. But if they feel there's something sinister going on, something that they tend to develop antibodies. What we also found was that people, where the agenda was quite stated and quite obvious and people were able to articulate it and verbalize it, they took a much more positive approach to that agenda. So, for example, carers who were able to say, look, we can't just deal with this at the moment. And there were really empathic responses from professionals to that carer burnout and that carer stress. But where it was not stated and it felt like someone was trying to get their family member into hospital through the back door or by saying particular things, the professional's stance would often harden up. This doesn't change the suicidality in the patient, but you are taking a very different stance because of what you have perceived. So that can be quite problematic in terms of decision making. We also then looked at resources and how resources or the lack of resources can push us into a rationalizing space. There isn't a bed. And so you kind of start looking for the information which justifies your decision not to admit or not to provide that help. So for example, in the school context, it may be a counselor has got so many children that they're looking after. So, in that rational versus rationalizing debate, if you would have looked at all the facts, you might have thought, okay, I can only look after 20 children at any point in time, but this child has also got needs that someone else needs to meet. I may not have the capacity, but someone else needs to meet that need, right? But if you know that there isn't anyone else and it will still land up with you, then you could then end up being, rationalizing it away that, oh, actually, there are these protective factors, they are these friends, they have their parents, and you could rationalize it away rather than just looking at the facts and saying, okay, maybe this person is not as unwell as the others, but they still have needs and they need to be met. Otherwise, you'll find that they will present much more unwell 2 months, 3 months down the line. So, yes.
One of the things that comes to mind for school counsellors with that is because of the number of students coming and the anxiety that sits around particularly a young person presenting with suicide ideation and the fear around a suicide happening at school or just in the community, that rather than going through the rationalizing, have I got that right? The
rather than being rational,
rather than rational, we can refer out quite quickly. And so it's referred out to a hospital, but then when they go through the process, it doesn't meet the standards for the hospital. And then we've got the student who hasn't been met by either service, which is even more risky for the student.
This is a problem worldwide, the missing middle, as we call it. So they are too risky for us in the school setting, as you said, not risky enough in the health setting, and they fall in the middle. Yeah, and it goes back to the first aware factor, which is anxiety. How much anxiety are they generating in the school setting, which makes you kind of pass the person on to the next level? But actually, when you come to the next level, you aren't making me that anxious. So actually, you go and you fall in the middle and the needs are not met. Here in Australia, there has been quite a significant, particularly in the last year, through COVID, with social isolation, there's been quite a big focus on the missing middle and what services are there for them. They're not as unwell for them to be in the health setting, but actually for secondary care health setting, but are too unwell for the GPs to manage. So that's kind of the phenomenon you're describing. And then the fifth of the aware factors, which was experience, and this could be professional experience of suicide, personal experience of suicide, and that has an impact on your decision-making process. Because if you yourself have had suicidal distress, that might give you keen insights into a person's journey, but it can also almost paralyze you It can create all sorts of rescue fantasies, boundary violations. So it's really important that you pick that up in supervision if that's the case. Particularly if you yourself are struggling with suicidality at the moment, that's something that you need support for. Keep saying you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to look after yourself first before you can look after others. Professional experience of suicide, if you have lost someone to suicide while providing them support, you could become quite risk averse. And we go back to that concept of the care compass that we talk about, risk averse, risk prone, and how do you continue to take therapeutic risks, positive risks to support the person's journey. Also, in terms of experience, we talked about experience of the student presenting over and over when you were talking, Tracey, about the counselors seeing them over a period of 6 months and how you could end up getting desensitized. And that can happen as well in terms of experience of the person, but their presentation might have changed, but you don't spot that because you have become desensitized and you've got a plan and you're just following the plan, but the plan needs to change with the presentation. So experience of having the same person or people of particular diagnostic groups, demographic groups is also quite important. So the AWARE chapter focuses primarily on clinical decision making. It's very focused on health, but were there particular nuggets that the educational sector you think can take away in terms of clinical decision making from the AWARE factor?
Oh, in all of them. When I went through my book, I'd put notes for them all of them. So we've talked about anxiety, waiting, definitely. The agenda. We've got multiple agendas within a school context.
Tell us a little bit about that, because this came up in the course itself. The agenda of the parents was a big one that came up, and often the stigma attached to mental health. And there were different agendas at play, which the counselors were talking about.
Well, I think even just to start with, within a school context, we have got different professionals under the same roof.
Mm-hmm.
So we have got educationalists and we've got counsellors and social workers. So to even recognise what those two different professions bring to the table when we're talking about a student at risk, to be able to name them and acknowledge them, and they've got different agendas with that. One has a very therapeutic, walking alongside, doing the assessing, being able to do that. The teachers, and understandably, it's not their profession, just want to make sure that they're safe. So there's how do we know they're safe? How can we be guaranteed that they're safe necessarily? Parents,
no guarantees in this at all, isn't it? You're looking for guarantees that don't exist. Yeah,
and that's a really key message to be able to keep sharing. There are no guarantees. There are no guarantees here.
And I think it's a desire for guarantee, which we see it in mental health all the time, where we actively discourage this, where people seek out safety reassurances. They ask questions like, can you keep yourself safe? Of course, they can keep themselves safe when they're with you. But when they're back out there with all the stresses that they're dealing with, who knows? Risk is dynamic. That statement makes us feel good about it, but actually doesn't change the risk or the safety at all for that person.
And so we put that in a school context by saying, actually, I can see that you're not safe or not well, therefore you can't come to school until you're in a place that you are, is a way of going, actually, we're doing what we need to do. But in fact, that student might be going back to a place where this is the source of the psychological pain, and school is the place that helps to relieve that. When it comes to mental health, absolutely, the stigmas around mental health. As I said,
sorry, Tracey, let's pick that up, because I think you made a really important point there around agendas. So the agenda of the head of year or the principal may be safety. And if that becomes the primary agenda, the impact that might have on your decision-making process in terms of, can you stay in the rational space or do you flip over into rationalising? So, and it's a very difficult balancing act for a principal, because they're looking at the needs of one person against the needs of the entire school, right? So you can see that they're trying to weigh this up. And it's natural for someone in a leadership position in a school to go, hey, I need to make sure that they are safe, and if something did happen, it doesn't affect the other students, because there is this contagion effect, right? So if you're really focused on safety, there may be a part of you which knows that actually school is a place which is therapeutic for this young person. But you may choose not to see that, given your agenda to maintain safety in the school. And that's just being human, right? You are trying to do right, not just by that one student, but by all the students. But by talking about it, you can bring it out into the open. So in the rational space, you can see, okay, they're the needs of this person, and school would be therapeutic. School would give him hope. School would help him move forward with his mental health recovery. But then there are these other needs of all the other students, all the other parents, if something did happen. But we don't tend to do that in an open, explicit fashion. It happens intuitively somewhere in the head in our decision making. So the rational versus rationalizing discussion is all about putting it out in the open, naming it for what it is, and how difficult a balancing act school principals, heads of years, teachers, class teachers, school counselors are having to act, because they're weighing up both of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a responsibility to the whole school community.
Yeah.
To weigh that up, and that the primary purpose of schools is education.
Yeah.
So we've got lots of agendas, different levels of power, different things going on. However, in saying all of that, I've seen it's been at schools lately where we've started to have conversations around these things, the different agendas, and where the school might be a therapeutic setting for the student, just being there, just being with their friends and being able to attend class, and how can we balance out the risks that we're seeing. So yes, I completely agree. When we can give words to things that are almost invisible, but they're at play, we actually can start to create change.
Yeah. If we are absolutely open, candid, and honest about it, and say, okay, let's put down on paper our primary agenda, which is maintain a safe environment in school, so nothing bad happens in school, which creates a contagion effect. Fine, let's put it out there. And then there's a secondary agenda. We have a responsibility to this young person who is struggling, and what is in this person's best interest, right? And then there are tertiary agendas as well, that me as a principal, if this happens in school, in my school, what does it mean for me? How do I look in the local newspaper? There are all these anxieties that suicide generates in all professions. And if we are able to talk about it, then you can begin to address some of these things. Otherwise, it just influences us, pushes us into the rationalizing space, skews us towards the decision that we want to make, because that brings our anxiety levels down, rather than that is the right thing for this young person, balanced against the needs of the entire school community. Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, actually. So you said that very quickly, so I thought, okay, let's labor this point home, because it's incredibly important. And then there are the agendas of parents. Sorry, you were going to say something else.
It's just what I was going to say, is the agenda of parents. I was going to say around 75 nationalities, and we know across culture, mental health is understood differently. The way we describe it, understand it, make sense of it is experienced differently. And so that can be a huge thing. Well, we have to be so mindful when we go into our conversations with parents around what is their understanding, how might this be perceived. I do remember many years ago in New Zealand working with a high school student, expressing or experiencing a significant level of depression. And she was so articulate, because she was a third culture kid, but being able to say, in my culture, there is no word for depression. There is no construct. She didn't use the word construct, but she was effectively saying there's no construct to help my parents even understand what I'm going through. And so immediately that support, that understanding wasn't there for her. So yes, the parents' agenda, it's not just their agenda, it's what we bring to the table, and history and culture and experience has a huge impact here. So a lot of the work is with the parents, helping them understand.
Like we had a showcase event at work today called the Rethink event. So it's a quarterly event that we have where we kind of share the learnings from different things that have happened. And the September event, because it's World Suicide Prevention Day, is themed around safety. And one of our nurses, Jamon, he was speaking about the cultural aspects of safety and what was. He brought up something which he's from Indian background, and something that myself being from an Indian background, and I've been in the UK and Australia for over two and a bit decades, and you forget. And Jamon kind of was saying that in the Indian culture there is this concept of rebirth and karma, right? So you get in the next life because of what you have done in the previous life. And he put it in a very articulate way, something that completely lost track of, having lived in a Western society for over 2 decades and a bit, that in certain Indian cultures, if you are in psychological pain, that is viewed as punishment for your bad deeds in your previous life. So if you can think about supporting someone, why should you be supporting someone if they are just being punished for something bad that they have done? And it was quite an eye-opening aha moment for me, because there were similar conversations. I remember a couple of decades back in India around disability. People with that, they have been born that way because of what they had done in the previous life, and those views were challenged quite, and hopefully that has shifted in the last 2 decades. But there's certain cultural contexts which if you're carrying there, and often people who have traveled from their country of origin to a different country are trapped in a time capsule. Like, I still think of India as I left it in 2000, but India has moved on, right? India has changed. It's particularly the metropolitan areas. It's a modern cosmopolitan country, very culturally diverse. It has moved on. But I have brought up my own children in the way in which I was brought up, because I have been in that time capsule for the last 20 years thinking that India is like that. But it's not like that. The country moves forward, views change. And so that was quite enlightening. Sorry, I've completely digressed. But the cultural dimension is so important. And 75 countries in the ESF schools, you kind of go, wow, you almost need a transcultural interpreter in there who would be able to kind of put things into context. So someone from a Somalian culture would be very different to someone who has been brought up in America and they have moved to Hong Kong, and very, very different to someone from India would be very different to someone who is from a ethnic Chinese culture. And there was a lot of conversation about transcultural issues relating to pressure and stress and what is considered normal in particular cultures, achievement and perfectionism, and how that can lead to suicidal distress. Yeah. I think it was mentioned in the course around how particular parents, around stigma and culture, and how particular parents would not actually accept that their child may be struggling with mental health challenges. That's quite a big acceptance. That radical acceptance is incredibly difficult for them, and it kind of triggers a lot of stuff around, okay, what have we done wrong? How did we end up in this place? So
yeah, and a lot of shame, a lot of having to save face. That happens a lot. We have parents who we might call up and we want to share. We've noticed there's some self-harming, and they say, oh no, that's from an accident. That's from they'll give you all sorts of things, but that might be around some cultural things, or it might be around some fear that their child's going to be kicked out of school.
Oh yeah,
they've had those sorts of experiences. So it's a matter of taking the time to be able to firstly connect, making sure that we're sharing that this is actually a safe school. We're not 22 schools that are looking to find reasons for that, but actually caring holistically for the child and really coming alongside and hearing the parents, where they're coming from and their concerns, and then working alongside, and then that changes. I figuratively always hold the client in one hand and the family in the other hand.
Yeah.
And I think we're always at risk if we and I have seen this happen before. We kind of put the family down because the child, the student's our client, but actually we're not. We're trying to bring bit by bit together, but we can't do that until we understand that context of where each is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, as a school counselor, even though children do spend a lot of time in school, you can't be present all the time. You have to bring the family, the parents on that journey of recovery, because that understanding is crucial. And that understanding, whatever be their stance, we have to meet them where they are. We have to validate that stance. And once you have validated that stance, you will find that conversation opens up. It becomes easier because whatever is their driver for doing that, at the end of the day, they want a child who is blossoming and flourishing, right? They have the same needs as the teacher and the school counselor. They want a child that's blossoming. And so there is that shared common ground. It's how you kind of get to that shared common ground by helping the parents see that, yes, you might be saying whatever you are saying, but there is no judgment here. And you have to convey it through your actions that there is no judgment. We are here for your kids. You are there for your kids. We have a common objective here, and somehow connecting over that. We're going to thank Tracey for giving her time generously for the recap of the AWARE framework today and stop the podcast here. For school counselors and educational psychologists, as well as teachers and heads of years and school principals in the English Schools Foundation, I hope the AWARE framework and the entire discussion about rational versus rationalizing in helping you to think about your thinking. The idea is to shine a light, to bring it into sharp focus, more light, less heat, about the decision-making processes you engage in. In the next podcast, we will pick up where we have left off today and do a recap of the STEPS model. Till then, please go through the course material and keep using the skills and strategies that you have gained in the training, because practice makes perfect, and over time, you will have progress to practice. Thank you very much, and you will hear from me next Friday again in conversation with Tracey Chitty from English Schools Foundation in Hong Kong.